automatic that you're not. Okay, right.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to our inaugural Neurohumanities Network event. We're so excited to have you all here. We're also very excited to have Dr. Alison Christy, who will give the introductory talk of this group. Before we start, we want to spend a few minutes just talking to you about what this group is all about. This group really started on the heels of the various efforts of the three members of our core team. Galina Gaiman was leading her own humanities initiative at the Mass General and Brigham, was a very successful initiative called Well-Rounded Wednesday. On the other side, Dr. Palmer and I were leading our own neurohumanities initiative at the Medical University of South Carolina, which had been running for 2 years and now has been continued. But acknowledging how much the humanities were important to neurology as a whole, we wanted to bring this to a larger audience, to a greater stage. And that's where we were joined by two wonderful volunteer medical students, Jay Doolittle and Connor Lewis, who've been really the creative force behind the social network efforts and social media efforts that you've seen so far. And also guiding our efforts is our advisor and mentor, Michael Stanley, who's been a true creative force behind our various initiatives. And we also want to acknowledge that we've had the support of the Arts and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School. We're very grateful. They provided some funding for some of this initiative. But before talking to you about what Neurohumanities is all about, we also want to spend a few words about what we want this space to be. And we want this to be a third space for clinicians, for artists, for humanists, for neuroscientists. And we want to have conversations that really are at the intersection of medicine, the arts and the humanities, and the neuroscientists. And you see there two wonderful artists who really encompass the meaning of neurohumanities. They're Priya Rama and Kate March. We want to build a community that is primed to take the humanities of the brain to the next stage. But what do we actually mean about humanities of the brain? What do we actually mean about neurohumanities? So this is the intersection of the humanities, the arts, and the neurosciences. And there are various and even contradictory ways to describe this. And I think that in doing so, we want to be comprehensive. And some of these definitions are some that come from the neuroscience community, discussing this as a partnership of neuroscience and the humanities. And this is really using a neuroscientific interpretation to the humanities. This is a great interpretation, but there are others. One would be romantic science, and this is something that Alexander Luria really espoused and something that he coined. And this is a science that preserves the lyrical and romantic richness of the arts. So you see here more of a non-reductionist view of approaching the neurohumanities. And then finally, when we are talking about clinicians and patients, the neurohumanities take a slightly different form. And this is the neurohumanities understood as using the humanities as a method for understanding the experiences of humans, including our patients. And then you can see the wonderful paintings of William Utermohlen, who unfortunately suffered from Alzheimer's disease. And in looking at all of these, I don't want you to be confused. I want you to circle back to the idea that this is a third space. So a space where you can reflect on everything that goes on in your life, and you can then reconnect the humanities, the arts, with this understanding of being a being with a brain and a nervous system and a mind. And how we're going to do this is in a variety of ways. One example would be what you will see momentarily here today, which is monthly virtual seminars. But we also want to create a community via our existing social media. We also encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter, visit our upcoming website, not quite there, but it'll be. And then, yes, compete in our contest. So stay tuned till the very end of the talk because we have a lot more to share with you. But on to today's event, we're so fortunate to have Dr. Alison Christy. She wears many hats. She's the clinical director of the Pediatric Neurology program at Providence Health and Sciences. She's also a director of the Providence Center for Pediatric Multiple Sclerosis and Neuroimmunology. She's the chair of the AN History section. She's been serving in this role since 2023. She was previously the vice chair from 2021 onwards. She's also the deputy editor of the Journal of Child Neurology. She's also a partner of Zachary London in making games, and she's done a few that are just wonderful, and now chairs Neurology and now chairs Pediatrics. She's also the mind behind Nerdle and much, much more. And on to today's talk, she's going to talk to us about Dorothy Russell and a brief history of disability and advocacy in neurology, and how and why to study the history of medicine. And now, Dr. Christy, take it away.
Wow, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for talking about the humanities and for having history as the first humanity that you guys are talking about. You may know that I do other humanities too, like I'm actually wearing a skirt with an embroidered neuron on, and I'll show you at the end if we have time. But interestingly, history is one of the 9 muses of Greek mythology. So what I just pulled up on my screen is a picture of the different of the 9 muses in statue form, and they are all women who were thought to represent the arts in Greek mythology. And it's interesting that history gets to be an art, and astronomy is the other one that's kind of interestingly a part of the arts. And here's history over here, Cleo.
Dr. Christy, so sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure we see your slides.
Oh, you're not seeing my. Oh,
you could try again.
Let's see this. Sorry, I had them up and then took them down again. So here we go. So up. Oh, there we go. So the 9 muses of Greek mythology are here, and so here is the Cleo in history. Here's Urania in astronomy, and the other ones are, dance, poetry, all the other music, tragedy and comedy, all the other great parts of the humanities. And honestly, I love all of them and how they communicate with medicine. And so I'm very excited to see how all this evolves going forward. So I am going to describe myself, which is a part of disability, of being disability aware and giving a talk. I'm a petite white woman with a blue sweater on and a black t-shirt. And I'm going to try to describe my slides, and sometimes I forget to, so feel free to call me out if I do. This slide is my title slide, so it talks about Dorothy Russell and a brief history of disability and advocacy and neurology, and it has my name and all the stuff that was talked about me, and it has my email address, and if you need that, I think it's AlisonChristy@providence.org, and I'm happy to talk with you about any of these things later. So the other thing you're seeing on the slide is 2 pictures from art history, of the history of art, every art is contemporary art at some point, right? One is a marble statue of an old woman from BCE 14 to 68, and the other is Peter Bruegel the Elder, the Beggars from 1568. And these are depictions of disability from history. And so this illustrates a couple of points. One is that disability has always existed throughout history. Every culture has had to find a way to deal with people who couldn't care for themselves, right? This is a thing we do in humanity in general with children, but people are born with birth injuries, people fall off something and have an injury, people have a stroke, and so every culture has had to figure out what we do with this. And so that is not new. And what you see with the with Peter Bruegel the Elder specifically is you see a group of people who are sitting in a public square, and some of them have lost limbs and they're using sticks to support themselves. And they're sitting in a public square because what they do in their society is they give alms to people in order to provide them with food. And that's, in some ways, that's nice. They get alms from people, right? The people walking by giving them alms get to feel good about themselves because they have supported these people who don't have any food. And there's also the aspect, so there's a transactional nature of that, right? Like, I'm giving to you, but I'm also getting to feel good about myself. And that is also an interesting aspect of this. And there's also a sideshow aspect of it too. The people who are walking by get to look at the people with disabilities and find it fascinating. And that's a piece of this that I think is important. It's also a piece of the art, right? Both the marble statue of an old woman and the beggars. There's a piece of it where you're creating art for awareness and advocacy, but also so that we can look at it and say, this is something as kind of fascinating, especially for us in medicine, because we go into medicine because disease is interesting and we find this thing very interesting. I wouldn't say that we can take the sideshow aspect out of the medical humanities, and I wouldn't say we necessarily even want to, but I absolutely think it's a thing that we need to be aware of when we're talking about it. So I have no relevant disclosures. I do some studies for pediatric migraine and MS. This is a picture from the endowed chair's neurology. So we make games for neurology, but we don't make any money off these games. They're available at nerdgames.com. This is a picture from endowed chair's neurology, and it's of Sarah McNutt, the first woman elected to the ANA. She's got brown hair, and she's a white woman, and she's pulling up her sleeve to show you the brain tattoo that we presume that Sarah McNutt probably had on her bicep. What you're also seeing is this picture here, identifying critical factors to academic success for child neurologists with a QR code. That is a survey we're doing to identify critical factors to academic success for child neurologists. And if you're a child neurologist who trained in the United States, please go fill out that survey. We only have a little bit of time to collect this data, and we would really, really, really like this data. And I will be your best friend. So I'm going to talk about Dorothy Russell. Dorothy Russell is best known for her textbook that was published in 1959, Russell and Rubinstein's Pathology of Tumors of the Nervous System. She was born in Australia in 1895, and her parents died when she was young. And she and her sister moved to England to live with an aunt. So what you're seeing here is a black and white picture of 7 girls. And this is Dorothy Russell here with the netball. She went to Girton College, which was an all-women's college that was started by a feminist, Barbara Bodichon. And then she wanted to go to medical school. The UK kind of lagged behind the United States when it came to allowing women to medicine because it was more traditional. So some women studied in Scotland, but it was very difficult to go to medical school in London. But during World War I, there was a shortage of physicians. And so they did allow women to study at the London Hospital Medical College for a brief period around 1918. And Dorothy Russell was one of those people. And what you're seeing here is her grades from morbid anatomy. She got 5 dots, which meant that she excelled in morbid anatomy. And she decided to go into pathology. And then here's a picture of a bunch of women, and one of them has a box around him, and that is Hugh Cairns. And he was a surgeon, and he said he was going to do neurosurgery, and she could be his personal pathologist, basically. He would do the surgery, she would study the pathology. A lot of times what you see in the history of women in medicine is that either women went into purely women's only spaces, or they found a few or a single male mentor who really protected them and helped support them along the way. And that was what Hugh Cairns was for Dorothy Russell. And that was really successful for her. So in 1935, she published a time-lapse film that showed pulsatile contractions of oligodendrocytes. This is a picture of oligodendrocytes from a different paper of hers. In 1946, she became the first female pathology chair in Western Europe. And here's a picture of her walking with a cap and gown on. And in 1959, she published this first comprehensive textbook of tumor neuropathology, the Russell and Rubinstein's Tumor Neuropathology. And then she retired. And when she retired hard. She didn't come back for grand rounds. She didn't keep teaching. She really left entirely. And then when she died in 1983, which is not that long ago in the scheme of things, there was this obituary about her, which is unlike any obituary that I've ever seen, where people talk about how she was really not all that friendly, and they didn't necessarily like her that much. And they nicknamed her the Lady. And they said she was formidable and she was forbidding. She was the mistress of the devastating put down. And then one guy says she deserved more recognition than she got. And so for me, I get a sense of this woman who, in this very male space, in this space where she is really struggling to succeed and actually survive, she's built a very strong shell around herself. But then after she died, This letter was in the British Medical Journal. Two of her colleagues wrote that her career is all the more remarkable because until middle age, she suffered from epilepsy. She told them about this 20 years before, and because she thought it might help them in counseling and encouraging their patients. And she said she wanted it to be known after her death, so she wanted it to be published so that others suffering from the same disability might learn that epilepsy is no essential bar to reaching the heights of any profession. So she has a card in endowed chairs. This is the card here. She's holding a stack of books, and one of them says Morbid Anatomy, and it looks like the books are all about to fall over. And her quote on the card says, "The hope with which we appeared in the future at any time is apt to be tinged with a certain amount of anxiety, and both emotions are heightened when evolution is rapid." So I want to talk a little bit about why Dorothy Russell might not have wanted people to know that she had epilepsy, what was going on culturally, historically at that time. Dorothy Russell was born in 1895, as I mentioned. In 1896 in Connecticut, there was a law put on the books that any man or woman who was, quote, epileptic, imbecile, or feeble-minded was prohibited from marrying or living together as husband or wife, provided that the woman was younger than 45. So there are a number of things to unpack here. For one thing, it's Connecticut. This was the first law on the books in the United States that was eugenic. And it's very clearly eugenic, right? Because it's all about making sure that people can't have babies that might have problems. And that's very clearly stated because it's all about the woman being younger than 45. If she's 50, we assume she's not having children, and so that would be totally okay. But it's not okay for people to live together if the woman's younger than 45. The other interesting thing about it is it has this word epileptic here, but there's no definition in the law of what that means, how many seizures you get to have, what kind of seizures you get to have, what, is it one seizure and you don't get to marry? Nobody says this. And by 1913, 35 of the 48 states had some kind of law limiting marriage or cohabitation of, quote, idiots, lunatics, epileptics, people of unsound mind, without a clear definition. Punishment would be fines or jail time. And it's unclear how often this was enforced or what kind of definitions were used to enforce it. The Connecticut law was repealed in 1967. This is an article from around the same time about that talks about a hospital for epileptics in Illinois. And in this article, there's a strikingly beautiful girl of perhaps 20 years, and they say it's a sad case. She's not insane, no, but what people might regard as a worse misfortune, she's epileptic. And we find out that she has seizures approximately once a month. But because she has seizures once a month, she can't get married to this guy who's totally in love with her. It also talks about the issues with the treatments for epilepsy at the time, which would be bromides, which were very sedating. So she's going to go live in this institution because of her seizures, which she has once a month. Along the lines of definitions, when Dorothy Russell was in her teens in 1908 in the UK, they tried to come up with some definitions really to determine which kind of people would need the most support. So this was intended to help people. They said, okay, we're going to classify people into 4 categories. We're going to say there's the mentally infirm who really can't manage their affairs at all. There's idiots who can't be left alone. There's imbeciles who can be left alone, but they can't have a job. And then there's the feeble-minded who can have a job, but not a very good job. But those are pretty vague definitions. And there's a lot of gray area in there. Over in France, Alfred Binet was commissioned in 1904 to come up with a way to determine which kids needed more help in school. And so he tried to make it a little bit more scientific. And he came up with the IQ test. And this was a test that was never intended to figure out who was a genius or not. It was supposed to be a thing to say who needed more help in school. And he and Theodore Simon came up with this paper in 1904 called Mentally Defective Children, which is kind of a gut punch. It seems like a terrible term, but the idea behind it was not terrible. The idea behind it was that, again, it was to figure out which students needed more help in school. And they argue in this paper that smart kids are going to be fine. Like smart kids, you can give them any teacher and they're going to learn whatever. Like they're going to thrive. And actually we should give quote, defectives, the best teachers. And this comes to a point that I want to make, that language doesn't exist in a vacuum. For Binet and Simon, they weren't using mentally defective children to be mean or to somehow degrade these children. They really wanted to help children, but culturally this becomes a problem, right, over time. And language becomes very ableist, and language it changes over time and is cultural. When we think that the thing that we're talking about is negative, the words we use to describe it will become insults and slurs. So I'm going to talk about a word that might be offensive to you if you're, say, from the UK, and it might not be offensive if you're not. So the word spastic has been in the medical literature for a very long time. This is a article from the British Medical Journal talking about spastic paraplegia in an acrobat from 1881. Spaz came into the vernacular, mostly in the African American vernacular, in 1959 as teen slang. It was insulting. It was an uncool person. And then in 1972, it was being used as a verb, to spaz out. In 1998, Jay-Z rapped, "I spaz like I'm on ecstasy." And then in 2006, Tiger Woods used spaz to describe poor putting. And that finally, like, there was a pushback. There was discussion about that on in newspaper articles. This is because in 1981 in the UK, there was a show called Blue Peter. There was a man with cerebral palsy on the show. And at that time, it became a playground insult. It became a slur. And it's still considered a very offensive and never word in the UK, much like the R word in the United States. Like, it's something you just don't ever say. Both Lizzo and Beyonce used it in lyrics relatively recently, and both of them apologized and changed the lyrics. And that's the thing, right? Like, none of us can be right all the time, and we're going to make mistakes. And we can't say, well, if we can't be right about language, we're just never going to try to do the right thing with language. We have to just evolve and change with the time as best we can. When we know better, we do better, right? That's the only thing that we can hope for. We can't just expect people to be right. We can't expect ourselves to be right. We have to forgive ourselves and do better. Similarly, the American Journal of Mental Deficiency was started in 1896. And so what you see here is 3 journal covers, the first one being the American Journal of Mental Deficiency. And again, this was supposed to be a clinical term that replaced things like idiocy and lunacy. So really, it made more clinical. It was a better term to use for people with intellectual disabilities. And that existed from 1896 to 1987. Then mental deficiency sounded wrong. So we said, okay, no, you're not deficient. It's just mental retardation, meaning delay, meaning that things are slowed down. So it's actually astonishing how short this period is that we called it that, because it became a slur and a never word so fast that now it is the American Journal of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And I think it's optimistic to think that it will stay that title. I think as long as we, again, as a culture, think that the thing itself is bad, the words we use clinically to describe it will turn into insults. That's kind of the way we are as people. Until we can accept that as an okay thing to be, the words we use to describe it will be bad. And similarly, the words we use like idiot, crazy, stupid, lame, psycho, those are words that are in our language, but are all terms that come from medical things to talk about people. For many of us, we're trying to evolve those out of our language. I think it's a good goal. Similarly, when we talk about people with disabilities, there's 2 ways to talk about people: with person-first language and identity-first language. Person-first language is to say a person with disabilities, a person with autism, a person with blindness, and a person with epilepsy. And as a person who does not identify currently as a person with disabilities, this is the language I use. And when I say currently with disabilities, I'll tell you 1 in 5 people in the United States has disabilities. And this something that can change tomorrow. I could have a disability starting tomorrow, and it could be something that's temporary, and it could be something that is not necessarily severe. So I can tell you at this moment, I am not a person who identifies as a person with disabilities. A person with disabilities might choose to use identity first language and say, I am a disabled person, I am an autistic person, and that is absolutely appropriate for them if that is how they identify. And this is what is considered appropriate in the disability community as of right now, at this time, and things could change with time. So back to Binet. So he created this IQ test in France in 1904. And then Goddard translated it in 1908 and brought it to the United States. And whereas Binet had this idea of using it to support children who needed more services, Goddard's intentions were less pleasant. So he had been studying this Kallikak family, and he felt that they had heritable, they had genetic feeble-mindedness. And he wrote in his treatise in 1908, "The idiot is not our greatest problem. He is indeed loathsome. Nevertheless, he lives his life and is done. He does not continue the race of the line of children like himself. It is the moron type that makes for us our greater problem." So, of course, this brings us back to eugenics. And the idea of eugenics, and what you're seeing here is Francis Galton in this little picture. The idea of eugenics was the word was coined by Francis Galton. And the idea is that you're arranging reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. You see a weather chart here on the side because he was also really into weather charts, and then his book here. Oh, that's him. So Francis Galton was the cousin of Charles Darwin, convenient. And Charles Darwin, they had shared a grandfather, this guy. And Charles Darwin, of course, in 1859 wrote On the Origin of Species, which is about natural selection. And actually, a lot of the book is about unnatural selection and breeding pigeons, but he wrote this book. And so you have is this sort of start of this understanding of science that we don't understand terribly well. And what happens is that society kind of takes hold of this early science and makes kind of assumptions about it, and then uses it cross-pollinates into society in different ways. And that's one of the big takeaways of this, I think, is that that's something that we still do in some ways today, and it's a thing to be cautious of. In 1865, Galton wrote Hereditary Talent and Character, which is basically about how really good fathers have really good sons. The male part is important. He thought that he and Darwin were both really successful because they were related, not because they both happened to be educated white men with lots of money. Around the same time, Mendel did his studies on pea plants that you've all read about in biology class, but interestingly, they were lost and then found again later in 1900. And so the ideas of eugenics is that you have negative eugenics, you decrease the reproduction of those who are weak, and then you increase the reproduction of those who are strong. And so you can see how these writings here in the 1850s and the 1860s bring us right to the eugenics laws that were in Connecticut. They're coming from this idea that if we can stop people from reproducing who have issues, that maybe we can change society for the better. But ended up being extremely harmful for people. For instance, Emma Buck, who is an older woman here in this black and white photo wearing a checkered dress, she lived in the Virginia State Colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. Her daughter, Carrie Buck, who is this woman with short, straight brown hair, she was raised by foster parents, and she became pregnant. And she claimed she was raped by the nephew, and he claimed it was consensual. She was committed to this colony, and the physician there wanted to sterilize her, Dr. Bell. This went all the way to the Supreme Court with Buck versus Bell in 1927. Supreme Court ruled in an 8-1 decision that compulsory eugenic sterilization was constitutional. Pierce Butler was a dissenter and did not write a dissenting opinion. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the majority opinion and said famously in this majority opinion, the principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. So as you can imagine, this wasn't popular with everyone. There were people who were protesting against it. So you're seeing here a picture. It's not actually, it's a picture from later, but of a person holding up a sign about it. This idea was not only harmful for people who are being sterilized, but also harmful for the idea of vaccination, because it's putting it in the same bucket as we can also take away your rights to have children. He also said 3 generations of imbeciles enough. Carrie was sterilized 3 months later, and her baby Vivian died of measles in 1932. And between 1924 and 1979, over 77,000 people were sterilized in Virginia. You see here a map showing that eugenic sterilization legislation is different in different states in the United States. Because once the Supreme Court said constitutional, it was down to the states to decide what they wanted to do legally. In 2015, Virginia awarded $25,000 to every person involuntarily sterilized and still alive. It's estimated that over 60,000 Americans were sterilized in 33 states. It probably is not surprising to anyone that there was a racial component to this as well. So what you see here is a map showing 1937 to 1966, and this top red line is Black women. This lower blue line is white women, and then down here are Black men and white men. William Lennox is a name that you probably know from the history of medicine. He is, of course, he was the president of the International League Against Epilepsy. He was the editor of Epilepsy and described Lennox-Gastaut syndrome in 1951. And he won the Lasker Award, which is often considered to be the American Nobel Prize, in 1951 for his incredible work in epilepsy in both diagnosis and treatment. But in 1938, he wrote a paper called Should They Live? Certain Economic Aspects of Medicine. And whereas there was this idea of eugenics in the early 1900s, by 1938, this was becoming less popular even in the United States, partly because of the Second World War, and also just partly because time is passing, and people's ideas about things were changing. And in Should They Live, William Lennox argues the number of unproductive members that society can support is limited. And of course, this is something we haven't talked about yet up to this point, but the idea of capitalism in America and productivity is a big part of this idea of eugenics as well. The idea that a good society, a better society, is a more productive society is an idea that many of us grew up with, but is an idea that should be challenged. And he says it's as simple as raising chickens. First, select, preserve, and improve the good, and second, eliminate the bad. And again, it's not something that is you can. The entire article is incredibly shocking and offensive, and you can't really say like, oh, he was just kind of out of his time and he knows it. He says, although the majority of doctors agree with the views which I shall express, they fear to say things distasteful to the unbridled sentimentality and intolerance of our times. And anytime you're like, everyone agrees with me, but they won't say it because they are just so woke, you are on the wrong side of history. If you learn anything from this talk, that is a thing to know. So he doubled down, actually, and in 1949, he wrote The Moral Issue in the New England Journal of Medicine, and was like, well, here we are giving antibiotics to children who have undeveloped or misformed brains, and we shouldn't be doing that either. So William Lennox, there's some neurologists who fall in gray areas where it comes to eugenics. He was pretty much not in a gray area, which is unfortunate because he also did some pretty incredible things too for epilepsy. But that's one of the things about people is they're very complicated. Foster Kennedy is another person who we know from eponyms, and he wrote The Problem of Social Control of the Congenital Defective, and believed that defective children at the age of 5 years should come before a panel of physicians who would then decide whether the child should live or die. So this brings us to the problem with eponyms. This is actually a statue of Woodrow Wilson, who is also a complicated person. And if you're in Portland, we're generally tearing down statues because statues are difficult, because no person is perfect. And so when you start putting up statues, then you're going to come up against problems. So the International League Against Epilepsy actually entertained the idea of changing the name of Lennox-Gastaut syndrome because of this, because I am not the first person to point this out. But because it would be so challenging for advocacy and awareness, family groups ask that they not change the name. So I think, again, it's important to discuss this kind of thing, and be aware of it. You know, if you're changing the name, if you change the name of leprosy to Hansen's disease, and you're constantly like Hansen's disease, by which I mean the disease formerly known as epilepsy, but also like Hansen has his own major ethical issues that we can talk about some other time. So there's other problems there too. So what happened? Basically, there was the doctor's trial in 1946. It was the first of 12 trials for war crimes for German officials that were held in Nuremberg. And 20 of the 23 defendants were medical doctors. This is the one female who was tried. And in this trial, the words eugenics and euthanasia were used a lot. And the United States wanted to really dissociate itself from these ideas that were used in the Second World War to kill people. So both these words basically became bad words, words that we didn't use anymore, and just saying, well, that sounds like this, was a way to say that was something we couldn't do anymore. And if you recall, in the 90s, when Jack Kevorkian brought back euthanasia, it was really a reclaiming of this term and saying, well, this is not actually a terrible thing. We can act this for good. These things aren't entirely black and white, but we haven't really reclaimed the word eugenics yet. For instance, the Eugenics Review existed until 1968, and most of the papers that are in the Eugenics Review are not things that you would find necessarily scandalous. They are studies of genes and heredity, but basically they couldn't exist forever. And we have some eugenics today. So we have things like embryo sex selection, genetic screening and testing of embryos, which we consider positive eugenics. And again, positive, I don't mean necessarily good eugenics. I mean that it's a way of selecting for the beneficial genetics. And then we have negative genetics, things like recent sterilization of female inmates in California that was reported in 2020. Ideas of population control, ideas of who gets to use ventilators during the COVID-19 pandemic, which ends up being a part of negative eugenics, and even things like advanced maternal age prenatal testing, which certainly has an ableist. It is ableist. It is ableist, but we also live in a society without free healthcare or a lot of support for children with disabilities. So it's a challenging ethical discussion. Here's Richard Dawkins talking on Twitter in 2020 that it's one thing to deplore eugenics on ideological and political and moral grounds. It's another to include that it wouldn't work in practice because, of course, it works on other animals. Why wouldn't it work in humans? But Oscar Vogt in the 1930s pointed out that in order to say that it would work in humans, you have to define what a good human is, and we're not actually really that good at that. We're not even, I mean, is a smarter human a better human? And is smarter in what way? And that is the complication, and that is why we have humanities. If we're going to say that we can do anything to build a better society, we actually have to define what a better society is, and what a better person, what it means to be a better person. So back to Dorothy Russell, and this is her picture again from the Nerd Games picture. So why do I think it's important to talk about a person like Dorothy Russell and her conflicting relationship with her epilepsy? Clearly, it was a challenging thing for her to talk about, but she also wanted people to know about it. She wanted her colleagues to know, and she wanted them to tell everyone about it after she died. Well, it isn't this. So this is a picture of a little girl running. She doesn't have any hands, and she's running on 2 prosthetic legs, and she's running next to a man who has 2 prosthetic legs as well. And it says, the only disability in life is a bad attitude. And this is what we call inspiration porn. And we call it this because it's not true, right? Like, it is, you know, a good attitude is great, but it's not going to give you prosthetic legs, and it's not going to turn a flight of stairs into a ramp. And so it ends up being a platitude that is meaningless, makes you feel good about yourself. And that's not, I think, the usefulness of this. But this is the usefulness of this. This is a tweet that was a response to Diana Sejas, who is a pediatric neurologist and an advocate in disabilities, and also a phenomenal writer. I highly recommend that you read her essays about her own disability. And she had a stroke during medical school, and so her dealing with with the medical system and being a doctor with disabilities. So someone wrote to her, I wrote off medical school as an option when I was younger because I mistakenly believed doctors couldn't have disabilities. And that is a danger, I think, when we think about how we advise medical students, how we think about ourselves in medicine, and how we think about whether someone could be, say, in our residency program or in our medical school. 1 in 5 people in America has a disability, but doctors are much less likely to identify as people with disabilities. And maybe that is because we have fewer disabilities, or maybe that's because we're unlikely to share. Charles Ehring, who is the Dean of Neurology in the University of Cincinnati and the president of the ANA in 1963, had polio as a small child, and so always had a limp. Kenneth Vista, who you might know from the Kenneth Vista Award, the AAN, had polio when he was 13, and he always used a wheelchair. This is Helen Tausig. She's not a neurologist. She's actually a cardiologist, and this is her picture from Endowed Chairs Pediatrics. She was a pediatric cardiologist, and she's holding a teddy bear, and she's got the stethoscope on the teddy bear. And she's notable. She had dyslexia, and she also had a hearing impairment, and so she used stethoscope enhancers, and she used her fingers to feel the heartbeat of children. And despite any limitations from her disabilities, she was able to develop the Blaylock-Thomas-Taussig shunt for children with tetralogy of Fallot, and was a phenomenal cardiologist. And that brings me to the ideas of accommodations and enhancements and things you can use to help disabilities, or the medical versus social model of disabilities. So the medical model is that the disabilities are caused by a problem with your brain and body and should be fixed or cured. And the social model is the idea that the problems are actually the environment, the barriers around them. For instance, I can't fly, but the society is not built for me to fly. So as long as I can walk everywhere, I'm totally fine. And you can imagine a society that would be built for wheelchairs, and then being in a wheelchair wouldn't be a disability at all. It would just be as easy to move around the world in a wheelchair as it would be to walk. I use glasses for distance, and that is not a problem because my insurance pays for the glasses, and nobody judges me for wearing glasses, and it's a very easy thing. And if I couldn't get glasses, that would absolutely be a disability. But because it's so easy to do, I don't consider it a disability at all. Neither model is simply exclusive. We can work to improve people's lives medically while understanding that there's nothing wrong with the way that they are right now. I think this is especially important when we think about things like neurodiversity and autism. We don't need to fix an autistic person. We don't need to make them normal, but we can accommodate them and improve communications and understanding with our goal. So both things can be, and we can still work to help people with medicine and fix and cure them, while understanding that if you can't fix and cure people, then fixing the environment sure is helpful. So that brings us to disability rights in the United States, which most usually is considered to start with Smith-Vest Civilian Vocational Rehabilitation Act. There were previous laws that helped people who were injured in war, but Smith-Vest was the first thing that helped people who were injured outside of war. Excuse me. Federally funded by Wilson. So, but otherwise not such a great guy. In 1946, you had the Hill-Burton, which was under Truman, grants, had grants to build hospitals. And then this is the American Standard Specifications for making buildings accessible to and usable by the physically handicapped. What you're seeing here is a hallway with people moving down the hallway in wheelchairs, and they're able to because of the size of the doors and the size of the hallway. This didn't say that people had to do this, but it was the first thing that was official from the American government saying how you could do it if you wanted to build a building that would accommodate people. Then in 1964, you had the Civil Rights which gave protected classes: race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And disability was not a protected class. There's still many things that aren't protected classes, like age, or how much money you have, or what your education is. There are certain things that are protected legally in the society that you can't discriminate against people based on. And this set a seed, people were like, well, couldn't we be a protected class, essentially? And by 1973, you had the Rehabilitation Act with Section 504, preventing discrimination against people with disabilities and programs receiving financial assistance. So libraries, schools. In 1975, you had the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which was then renamed in 1990, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Before this, you could literally bring your child to a school, and if they had disability, if they were in a wheelchair, if they were blind, then they could be like, we can't educate your child, you have to take them home. And it's amazing to think about, but it was absolutely a thing before 1975. So these laws were passed in the 70s, but nothing was happening about them. Basically, they were just sitting there on the books, and people were not getting services. So then there was this amazing disability rights protest in 1977 in multiple cities across the country. And in San Francisco, they did a sit-in in a government building for 26 days. You can imagine, they actually lived inside this government building. They ate there, they brushed their teeth there, they slept there for 26 days. And then finally they convinced this guy, Joseph Califano, to sign these revised regulations. And this is a subject of a Netflix documentary called Crip Camp: The Disability Revolution. It's called Crip Camp because it's about a camp that Judy Heumann, who is one of the masterminds behind the sit-in. She went to this camp as a child, and then she also was part of this sit-in, which in some ways was like a camp. And it's a phenomenal documentary. I highly recommend it. Judy Heumann died fairly recently in 2023, and she was a really incredible person. You see here a picture of her sitting in front of a microphone with glasses, and an article that says "Woman in Wheelchair Sues to Become Teacher." So basically, she was one of the people who rolled up to a school and was told, you have to go home, we can't accommodate you here. And her parents fought for her to go to school. She sued New York City to become a teacher. And one of the articles at the time, it's not actually this one, but one of the articles was, in the United States, you could be in a wheelchair and you could be president, right? Because FDR was president, but you can't be a teacher in New York City. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. She founded Disabled in Action in 1970, co-founded the World Institute on Disability in 2003. She worked with Clinton, the World Bank, and the Obama administration, and then she even had a podcast later in her life called The Human Perspective. And what you see here is a picture of Judy Heumann in a brightly colored shirt, and she's holding two books, and one is Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability activist, and the other is the children's version of it called Rolling Warrior. So this is the point where you should pay attention, because this is something you don't get a lot in your neurology education. So in 1990, they came out with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this allows equal treatment and equal access with people with disabilities, employment opportunities, and public accommodations, and defines disability broadly as mental and physical medical conditions that substantially limit one or more major life activities. The condition doesn't have to be severe, and it doesn't have to be permanent. And but equality in theory doesn't necessarily mean equality in practice, right? So if I ask my employer for reasonable accommodations and they don't feel like they're reasonable, then what do? Can I sue? Do I complain harder? It becomes a whole thing. And if I am, say, a medical student and I complain about my disabilities, but I complain because about not getting accommodations, but I'm also complaining about, say, microaggressions, and I'm also complaining about harassment, then the intersectionality of other components comes into this as well, because now I'm a complainer and nobody wants to work with me because I'm a complainer. So even if there's theoretically equality for people for disability rights, it doesn't necessarily equate to actual equality. Because of social stigma, people might be reluctant to share their disabilities with their employer or ask for the mandated accommodations. So even though disability shouldn't require extensive analysis, and theoretically, you shouldn't need a letter from a neurologist to say that you have a disability, or and people shouldn't need your diagnosis. It is kind of the least we can do to help patients with disabilities by providing these accommodations. I've actually had 2 meetings with trainees this week to talk about accommodations that they are not receiving from their programs. So this is a thing that is still ongoing and happening today. So I want to talk a little bit about why I study history. So I tried to make this talk shorter so we could get to this piece. This is a picture from a book called Neurology in a Nutshell. And it says, a long time ago, 3 doctors discovered how the brain worked. And all 3 doctors are in sort of black and white sepia tones, and they're all dudes. And this says Boulogne, but it's supposed to be Duchenne. And this is Charcot and Romberg. And I hate this. I hate this a lot. Like, this is not, like, nobody discovered how the brain worked, and like 3 doctors, really? Like, we're all like kind of working toward this all the time. And also it's just these dudes who are boring looking. History is so much more fun than that. And I feel like this, I feel like this changes how we think of neurology, even if you think that back in time, 3 doctors discovered how the brain works. I think that it's important for us to be able to see ourselves in our history and to see our challenges in the people who came before us. So I did a PhD in immunology, and reading that Marie Curie, who won 2 Nobel Prizes and was incredibly successful, that she took entire years off of science because she felt depressed, that was really helpful for me. It meant that if I didn't feel like going to the lab that day, it wasn't that I couldn't be a scientist. It meant that sometimes scientists don't want to be scientists. Like, sometimes it's just hard to get to the lab that day. Like, knowing that other people have challenges, knowing that Dorothy Russell was considered not so nice by her colleagues makes it okay for me to not be so nice sometimes too. And that, I think that seeing these challenges, I think when we see this history, I think it helps make our day-to-day lives easier. I think it also helps us understand the culture of medicine. And I hope that I tried to convey that to you today, talking about this disability culture and talking about the history of eugenics and how neurology played a role in that as well. I think that when we think about how our patients react to the word epilepsy, and also how we have been taught about epilepsy, or how we approach, say, talking to families about, say, the risk of epilepsy versus the chance of epilepsy, that some of this comes from a whole back cultural idea about what epilepsy means for a person. And I also think that it helps open us up for change, by which I mean that, and one of the other talks I give is a lot about how medical schools and medical institutions were constructed in this country. Knowing that things are constructed helps you see how things don't have to be this way. If things were made by a guy, like in the 1800s, then we could fix that. Like, there's no reason why we have to keep it that way if some is just somebody's idea and they didn't have any like date on it or anything. Like, they just thought that maybe this would work, and we venerate things unnecessarily. This is why I study history. I think that other people have completely other reasons to study history, and I am very excited that we have time to talk about that, because I would love to hear why the people in this room think that we should study history. How do we study history? So one way we do it is with secondary sources. So you read a fun microhistory about something, and that is totally cool, and I love it. The other way, well, let me see if I can pull this up. I'm going to try to share a different screen for you so you can see, because I do a lot of my history research just through the internet. And I'm going to show you a little bit about what that means. Maybe.
Let me know when you're ready to share your other screen, because right now we can only see the PowerPoint.
Oh,
I think
actually had
if you share your desktop, it should work better.
yeah. If I pull this over here, do you see it? No.
Not yet.
Okay.
Maybe you could try sharing and unsharing. Unsharing and sharing.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Stop share. Okay. So this is a website that you may have heard of called PubMed. So I just typed in brain into PubMed, and so it's already set up because that's what I do. So I did sort by publication date, and I said basically oldest to newest. And if you're just looking for like what might be interesting, you can type in the thing that you're interested in, and you can see PubMed goes all the way back to 1784 on things on the brain. And so you can find all kinds of interesting historical things just looking at this. And a lot of it's free. So I can go here into this description of an apparatus attached to the trephine and the operation of trepanning, by which wow, that sounds cool. Like, and I can just click on it and look at this. Like, there's picture and it's super cool. And like, so that's one resource. Another great resource is Google Books. I'll just go into Google and I can just type in like brain. I just typed in Google, that's good. So brain, and then I go into books. And then also here, similarly, you can say anytime, and I could say 19th century. And then look, I have all these things, all these old books about the brain. So I do this kind of thing for fun. It's okay if you don't do this kind of thing for fun. Like you don't have to look up old brain stuff, but like if you have a specific question, like I really want to know about the history of this thing, then you can look up the specific history of that thing, and then you can look at those dates. And for instance, with say if I'm looking at people, if I'm looking at Dorothy Russell, I'm going to look her up in all these different sources. So the other place is the Wellcome collection. Look, it just pulls up that, but I can also just type in brain. See, I did this earlier to see if I could do this. You just search, and then you can look at all these old things on brains, and they have these really cool pictures, all these old books. It's actually kind of amazing what you can get to in the Library of Congress has a lot of old stuff. For instance, it has, if you know Elizabeth Blackwell, she's the first female physician. She was the first woman to get her MD in America in 1849. And you can find all of these papers because her family was well off, and they saved everything. And you can find all these old diaries. Look how it says useful diary on the cover. Isn't that great? And you can find all this like original stuff, and it's super fun to be a historian in 2024 when you have the full internet at your service. The other thing you can do, what else did I put up here? So look at Hathy Trust. So again, this is another library source. They have a lot of things. So if you need things that are not in English, this is a really good source. I was doing a project on a French person recently, and lots of really cool old papers, old books. And all of this is open access. All of this is available. I can request things specifically from my librarian, but with this, I can just get to it right away. Let's see what else I've got. Oh, so this is a fun thing. So I have a subscription to newspapers.com, and I love newspapers.com. I could spend all day on newspapers.com. So I could type in, say, I could type in brain, and I could say, I only want brain from 1800 to 1900. I got a lot of people who are named brain. That's not as much fun. I can type in neurology from 1800 to 1900. And then you get these like cool old articles that are all about neurology, and you find some weird advertisements, and newspapers are super fun because they give you an idea of what is going on culturally at the time in a way that books might not give you. Ancestry.com is another great source, especially for people, for figuring out things about people. I think those are my main sources. Librarians are a great source. So I was at the OHSU library, and I was looking up a Oregon female physician, Esther Pohl Lovejoy. And then I was like, this has been great. Do you have other people I should know about? And she was like, oh, I don't know. Have you heard of the Lucy Davis Phillips collection? And I had the Lucy Davis Phillips collection, but it was this woman who collected, this registrar who collected all of these. She surveyed graduates from the University of Oregon on their advice for women who might want to go into medicine. And this is all online, but I had no idea. The librarians happened to tell me. I'm sure there are other things out there like this that I have no idea about, but I just have to find some librarian and be like, hey, tell me the things that you know about. It's incredible. So lots of cool resources, and I would love to hear about the resources that you guys know about too. I'm going to share my other screen again. And so if you're going to like write a paper, if you're just doing this for fun, just do it for fun, and it's great. If you're doing write a paper on it, then you should come up with some kind of thesis or hypothesis, just like you would in science. And ideally, it should be in some way pertinent to people who are around today, as opposed to doing a book report. No one wants to read your book report because, I mean, honestly, like we could all do our own book reports. But there's so much history out there about neurology that hasn't been written about and talked about. And I find things all the time. And I mostly find things by, I'm looking at some primary source and I'm like, oh, this is so weird. I wonder if there's more about this. And then it turns out no one's looked into it before. This is another question I think is really interesting. How do we share history? Well, you can write an academic paper, but then it has to be like a novel, interesting idea. And it is hard to get academic papers published in history. It's not like you can just, it's not super easy. You could do a poster, that's easier than a paper. You can give a talk. You could talk about it on Twitter. And so that's a thing that I do at Oligoclonal Band. And that's a great place to talk about things like I did put up these Lucy Davis Phillips quotes because it's just a great way to be like, hey, this thing is cool. Does anyone else think this is cool? I think this is cool. Some topics that are more sensitive, like, I don't know, if you're going to talk about eugenics, you should be probably pretty careful. But if you just like sharing an interesting fact about history, it is a good place to be. I think that fiction and fictionalized stories can be a really effective way to communicate ideas about history. And so I'm bringing this up in part because I know we've got other humanities people here. I think about things like Hamilton, many historical inaccuracies in I mean, obviously, like it is intended to be historically inaccurate, but then also like actual historical inaccuracies in Hamilton. But my kids know all the dates that things happened because of Hamilton, and also the Nathan Hale comic books, which are fictionalized. Like, I mean, there's a lot of like really good stuff out there that is fictionalized that can actually teach you a lot about history because it makes it interesting. And then games. So of course there's endowed chairs, which is not really a game to teach you about history. The women are just characters that are in the game, and so it is not a great example. But I bet that many of you know a lot about the Oregon Trail, and it is not because the Oregon Trail was a great defining moment in the history of the United States. There are probably bigger, more defining moments in the history of the United States that you know less about, but you know a ton about the Oregon Trail. And I have a 12-year-old son, and last night at the dinner table, we were talking about how he knows more than anyone else in his history class, and it has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with Civilization 6. And then I was like, so there's this idea that guys all think about the Roman Empire all the time. And I was like, so how much do you think about the Roman Empire? And he was like, well, I mean, kind of a lot, actually. So I have a budding historian, maybe. Anyway, games, fiction, things that are fun, right? That's how we learn. That's how we learn, and we learn well, and it sticks with us, and we care about it. And I think that's the goal. Like academic papers are great, right? But the goal is really to get people to know things, then you want to make it fun. So this is my email address, AlisonChristy@providence.org. This is a picture from the sit-in in San Francisco in 1977. This is the survey that you should definitely fill out on identifying critical factors to academic success for child neurologists. This is endowed chairs neurology and pediatrics, and this is an embroidery I did. And I'm happy to take any questions and have a conversation about humanities and
Dr. Christy,
medicine.
this was stellar. This was amazing. I loved how you took it from Bruegel, from arts, to Dorothy Russell, to the history of language and the history of disability, all the way to how to do historical research, which you taught me many tricks tonight. So
That's good. I'm going to
absolutely.
expect you to follow through on that.
No, it's been absolutely wonderful. I'm gonna open the floor. I could ask you 30 questions in a row, but let me open the floor and see what folks had to ask. And otherwise, I can get us started while people are thinking, and feel free to type your questions in the meantime. But I really liked how you talked about how language changes over time and how we need to be intentional, but also we need to be flexible with our language. I also really liked at the start how you talked about the way in which the way in which medicine itself is about showing and is also about performance. And can you sort of circle back to what you were saying about Bruegel early on?
Yeah. So the idea about Bruegel is that one of the things that draws us into medicine is that disease is interesting and cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we may not necessarily want to admit that, but it is. I mean, it's fascinating, right? Like there's a thing of like, come see this patient, not necessarily because it's educational for you, but because it is weird and cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
No one wants to be that patient, right? And but I think we've all been in that experience, in that experience as a student, at least, if not as a preceptor. So I think it's a thing to be aware of because we should think of ourselves as the patient.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also, I think that there is a part of drawing people into medical humanities that is like, look at this cool thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. It made me think about the film Freaks, which has this tarnished legacy, but also it's been reevaluated. And this idea that on the one hand, society tries to, you know, enclose away anyone that's different, right? And where actually showing may show more openness and more openness to what is not allowed within the realm of society, whatever that century's normal is supposed to be. So definitely interesting.
right, how much of it is exploitative and how much of it is advocating and increasing awareness? That's a challenging thing with that movie, and particularly, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's also
Or
interesting
with
how you go
sideshows
ahead.
in general, right? It was a way for people to work. And so I don't think that the people who were in the sideshows necessarily would have said, I am being exploited right now. I mean, different people had different takes on it, right?
Mhm.
But we look at it now and and it's much more complicated.
Absolutely, yeah. Even museums like the historical museum, medical museums, which showcase.
Mhm.
Yeah, very, very interesting. We have a question in the chat from Bakhtawar Ahmad. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. They were saying that they just started dabbing in history research and they're loving it. The question, which may be a rookie question, they say, is how do you access archival material at different institutions? Often you find awesome resources at archives, but without going there, there is a limit with how much you can request online via email.
Yeah, so that is absolutely a problem. And sometimes some libraries just don't get back to you too. And that is, yeah. So, I mean, yeah. You got to go there if you don't know somebody who's like physically there. So what I'll try to do is if I know I'm going to be in a town, like when I was in Cincinnati, I knew I wanted to learn about R-ing. So I like went to so you can call them ahead of time. And generally, if you're there physically, librarians will open their doors and you just make an appointment. Like they'll open their doors, they'll show you everything. Like it's great. But yeah, if you're not there physically, it is a challenge still. Unless it's things that you're finding online. There is a ton of information online though. But yeah, I tend to emphasize that because it's a thing that we can all get to, whereas institutional archives are going to be a thing where you got to go there if you really want it often. But it is no harm. There's no harm in emailing them and saying, "Can I have these things?" Because sometimes you do get some pretty cool stuff too.
And while we're waiting for some more questions, another question that came to mind would be, over time we've seen terms change and we've seen even perspective of how we should treat folks with disabilities. They've changed over time, right? What do
Yeah.
you think would be a good way to make sure that we're keeping our mind open enough? Because it's easy enough in hindsight to say that epilepsy is not, we shouldn't discriminate against folks with epilepsy, but even to have that recognition, to be someone with Dorothy Russell who is open about their own disability takes a lot of creativity and courage. What
Yeah.
what do you think would be some helpful ways to navigate?
So one of the tenets of the disability community is nothing about us without us. And I should say like that this talk was created with people from the disability community for that reason, that um also, I mean, any individual person in the disability community might have their own entirely different take on things too. Sorry, the sun is like right in my face here. Like there we go. um, So, so I'm part of a consortium of pediatric neurologists who I was particularly interested in this, but it is challenging, and it is also challenging of like how do you share that things have changed with people? I mean, who might not be, say, on social media. Do you do a paper in neurology saying we don't say this anymore, we now say this other thing? As a journal editor, what I'll do is just send a message being like, this isn't the current terminology. I mean, again, I think it's really important to not be judgmental about that because people are generally using the terminology that they think is correct and kindest. But saying that this is not the current terminology that we use. For instance, saying now we say genetic variation instead of genetic mutation. And correcting people in papers so that as people start to see it in papers, they will hopefully correct their own language as well. And but it is a good, it's almost like we need like a newsletter every month being like, this is what we say now. And I think the other thing is if someone says, hey, wait up, we're not using the term special needs anymore because they're really just needs that people have, then you say, oh, I didn't know that. Sorry. I'm gonna change that in the future, just sort of being willing and open to, as opposed to being defensive and being like, well, I didn't mean to, of course you didn't mean to offend people. Nobody's like kind of gunning to I wouldn't say nobody, but for the most part, we're all trying to do our best out here.
Absolutely. I love how you said if you're complaining about people being woke, you'll be on the wrong side of history.
Real though.
So we have some more
You see things like that in writing, and it's interesting because you could feel like, say, with eugenics, that you could feel like most people were on the side of eugenics because there's much more writing that's pro-eugenics than, say, anti-eugenics. But honestly, it seems like that's because the general societal thing was anti-eugenics, and so people are defending it. And so most of the writing is like, no, we should keep doing this, even though you disagree with it. And yeah, so that's interesting.
We have some more questions that popped up.
Yeah.
From Raphael Kardang, wondering what you think of the current generation, its emphasis on the now, and even a disdain for the history, or at least disinterest. How do you bridge the gap and pique their interest?
Yeah, so for one thing, as a historian, I think that people are always like, kids nowadays are terrible. And that was true in the medieval society, and that was true like 50 years ago. And like people were always like, kids nowadays have no interest in history, but like it's always going to be a select group of people who have interest in history. And specifically in medicine, people aren't interested in history because it's not on our tests, right? Like if it were on the boards, people would be very interested in history, but they're not because it's not on the boards. I think that you have to, because it's not something that you have to learn, it's not a requirement, you have to make it fun. And so that's why I had that slide on how we share it, because the thing I think about a lot, like I think these are important things to know, but how do I make people care without being, say, dishonest about it, and more sensational than is necessary? I think the only way is to make it fun. Yeah. And I again, like I see that in my kids. Like I think that they really gravitate toward the games, the graphic novels, the things that entertain while they teach.
Yeah, I heard the
But I would open
term.
up to the audience too. Like, what do you think?
I heard the term juvenoia being used as the constant kids nowadays, a refrain that goes on through history.
It's pretty great.
And we have another question while our audience is thinking about the question that you sent back to them. Definitely type in whatever thoughts you have about history and the interest that people may have and how to pique their interest. But we have another question that is, what do you see as the current issues in neurology that future disability scholars are likely to talk about in 20 to 50 years in a similar way as we talk about now?
That is such a good question. Yeah. So I mentioned that there are things about prenatal testing that seem ableist, and I would kind of hope that that will be something that will seem kind of shocking that we did. Because right now I don't think that I could judge anyone for building the family that they want to build it, but just like we think of sex selection as being kind of shocking because it is more or less okay to be presenting female and male in the society, I would like it to be so okay to have disabilities that we don't have prenatal testing. But I 100% don't think we're there yet, or even close to like getting close to there. But when people are upset about that kind of testing, then I would say that what we really need to work on is universal health care, is accommodations in schools, is making it easier to raise children with disabilities. We need to do that anyway, so I think that's one piece. And then I think the other piece is probably gender and pronouns and non-binary people and things like that we haven't really touched on today, but I think that's going to be an interesting piece of everything in 20 or 50 years.
Yeah, no, well said. We have lots of thank yous coming your way. Everyone loved the talk. We have one more question. Do you have any recommendations for books on the history of medicine? Not necessarily history books, but just those that touch on the historical aspects of diseases or phenomena.
I tend to not do a lot of secondary sources, so I don't tend to know it, and especially like contemporary things. So I don't tend to like really know how to answer this question. But I think and I don't know people off the top of my head because I'm trying to think of hold on, I'm going to Google real fast.
We can crowdsource, put it in the chat.
Yeah, crowdsource, do that. Because nothing's coming to my mind right now, but I somehow was not expecting that question.
There is one that I have in our bookcase, but I can't remember the name. It's like,
oh yeah, History of Henrietta Lacks is amazing, and also I should say Medical Apartheid is one that is about the history of separate but equal in medicine, and it's also excellent.
Someone put in the chat The Idea of the Brain by Matthew Cobb.
Twice as Hard is a book by Jasmine Brown. She wrote it when she was a medical student, and it's lives. So again, like my interest is women in medicine. She wrote about the lives of Black physicians, and she does a great job. And again, I feel like seeing struggles, like I feel like that makes it feel like it's okay when you struggle.
Yeah. We also have Angel of Death, the story of smallpox. Yeah, what you said about paying the gift nobody wants. What you said
I
about
read that one. That's an old one. That's like really old school. But leprosy is the history of leprosy is one of my passions. Just a side passion.
Ellie, you and I should talk.
We should talk. We should talk. We should make a game.
Yeah, and you know what you said about struggling was really interesting because a lot of medical biographies on titans and founders of medicine tend to be hagiographic. They tend to be almost the history of saints, and these people were perfect until you find something about William Lennox, and they become somewhat of a takedown piece. I think highlighting how these folks are human, which is mostly how biographies that are not medical historical biographies tend to go, and less hagiographic. I think showing the light side and dark side of everyone is a great way to do history. So
I didn't in order to make this talk shorter, I didn't talk about there are people who were involved in eugenics, but not in a way that was very clearly like, say, Lennoxy, where it was like, kill off all the bad people, but more in a way of like, let's explore, are there differences about the structural characteristics of the brain that can tell us whether someone is a criminal and Myrtle Canavan was one of them, and Louise Eisenhart was one of them, and Oscar Vogt was connected through genetics, and there are others. But it's hard to talk about it because you need time. You need time to be able to say, like, these are people who are doing science, like in the science, and the word eugenics is right there. Oh yes, that's Rosalind Franklin, Dark Lady. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's wonderful. And but you need to, because we want to see things in black and white, like these were the good people and these were the bad people, but really like they're just people who are just kind of functioning in their society, and we, you know, and then there's Lennox, who was like, you know, outside of even like what was considered appropriate in the society at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have many.
And I would say, like, when we talk about things like slavery, like that's different, like that's, you know, that's very clearly wrong regardless, like but and people knew that, like, and they talked about that at the time, like it's, you know, it's different than something like eugenics, where it's really more like we're just trying to figure out, like, is this a thing? Like, are there hereditary components to the things that we think make society better or worse? Which is, it's a hard thing to talk about. Like it's really complicated. I mean, it's that's why I like it. I mean, I like it because it's not easy.
Absolutely, and you navigated so well during the whole presentation. So thank you very much. I think we're wrapping up, but thank you, Ali, so much for leading this wonderful discussion today. And thank you
Thank
all
you so much for having me. Delightful.
And thank you all who came, and let us share with you a few announcements that are upcoming. Galina, I'll share my screen and you'll go ahead.
Yeah. And while you do that, I just want to say thank you again, Dr. Christy. I have to say that, you know, you started us off with the image of the muses, and you've really put us up to our task. We're going to have to reach, you know, as high caliber on all our topics as you started us off today with history. And it makes only sense that we ground ourselves in history before we, you know, extend to the future. But I just want to say thank you again.
Anytime.
With that, I hope that you enjoyed our first inaugural talk and that you'll be back here for more, coming soon to a Neurohumanities Network gathering near you. We are excited to announce that our next seminar is set, and in the theme of Old Hallows Eve, as we're coming into October, we're excited to welcome Dr. Eric Leonardis, who will talk about body horror and the brain. So make sure you don't miss that one. And we're also starting to think about booster sessions, what we're calling booster sessions. So we recognize that our core curriculum that we're offering is lecture-based, but just as Dr. Christy said, it's more fun if you learn more if you have fun. And so we're thinking about offering interactive hands-on sessions that will actually let you practice the arts and humanities. Things like dancing, adaptive dance, finding your narrative through creative writing, and also thinking about medicine in the stove and cooking. And yes, cuisine counts as arts and humanities, as Mattia convinced me. So that will be on feature, on the menu, shall we say, in the coming months. So if you have your ideas for lectures, sessions, you want to lead a session, lead a local group, please let us know. Be in touch with us. And finally, the last thing we want to announce is that we're happy and excited about our very first contest. So for the month of October, we're opening up for you to submit your art, your humanities, your creative insights. And our task to you is to reimagine the cookie theft picture in the spirit of Halloween. That's all we're going to say. That could mean taken any number of ways. Start submitting your submissions. That if it's, you know, a physical object, you can submit a photograph, or if it's an object that you can email to us, please do so. We'll accept any submissions over the course of the month to our Gmail. When you submit, make sure you include your name, a title of the work, as well as any social media if you're on it, so that we can tag you. And by submitting it, you're giving us your permission to share this with our network. We'll post it online and open for voting. Submissions will be posted as they come in, and then we'll have a voting period after our lecture next month for 24 hours. And the best vote, the submission with the most votes by popular vote will be the winner, which will be announced on Halloween. So if you have any questions, email us, or just go ahead and go with what your creative idea is. And we're excited to hear from all of you.
And thank you all for coming, and have a good night. You can always engage us, reach us via social media, email, and soon
We just
our
ask that you
website.
come next time and you bring a friend.
Have a good night, everyone.